My name is Fran Silva-Blayney, and I'm with the Sierra Club. I will be moderating this evening's panel discussion, which is sponsored by the Sierra Club, Conservation Colorado, Clean Water Action, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, Environment Colorado, Green Latinos, and Earth Justice. We'd like to thank participant media for making this event possible. We hope that you've all had an opportunity to watch the movie Dark Waters. The subject of that movie is PFAS contamination and the attorney who succeeded in a legal battle against DuPont. Just a quick background on PFAS. PFAS stands for perfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS refers to a class of chemicals that for decades have been used in firefighting and other industrial uses around the country. These chemicals are especially dangerous to those most vulnerable, including pregnant women, children, and people living in close proximity to industrial sites. High levels of PFAS contamination in drinking water have been linked to cancer, kidney and thyroid disease, immune suppression, and other serious health problems. For further information about PFAS chemicals, we'll be providing links in the chat. We've got a great panel for you. We're going to hear from PFAS attorney Rob Bilott. He's the author of the book Exposure and the hero of the movie Dark Waters. We'll also be joined by Mark Favors and Liz Rosenbaum, who have been directly impacted by PFAS contamination in Colorado. I'll be your moderator, and I will also share information about what the Sierra Club and other activists are doing to advance protections against PFAS pollution in Colorado. Just a quick note, we're going to hear from our panelists first, and we've left time at the end for questions for our panelists. So please submit questions in the chat. The chat will be monitored and your questions saved for the latter part of this event. So now I'm going to turn to our panelists, and each will give a brief synopsis of their work and advocacy around the PFAS issue, and then we'll have a question and answer session for viewing. We're also going to provide an action that everyone can take to help in this continuing fight to help better protect our communities from PFAS chemicals. So Mark, we're going to start with you. Mark Favors is a military veteran, a registered nurse, a PFAS advocate, and he grew up in Fountain Valley, which is south of Colorado Springs. In 2016, he and other area residents discovered that they had been drinking water contaminated with PFAS from nearby Peterson Air Force Base. Mark is joining us today from New York City. And Mark, I would first like to thank you for your service to our country and for your current service as a frontline worker at a hospital in New York City. And I know you're seeing firsthand the impacts of the coronavirus epidemic. Mark, Dark Waters tells the story of DuPont poisoning drinking water in Parkersburg, West Virginia, but your family and others experienced something quite similar right here in Colorado. Can you tell us what effects that PFAS chemicals have had on your family and the community?
Sure. Yeah. At Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, where my mother worked for 40 years, in 2016-17, the Air Force admitted that they had been dumping these toxic PFAS chemicals via AFFF firefighting foam into my family's drinking water source for over 30 years. From 1991 until 2016, they would dump these chemicals at least 3 times a year. And subsequently, a lot of my family members, including both sets of my grandparents, have died of cancer. And 4 of my family members on both sides have died of kidney cancer, in which PFAS chemicals have been linked to chemicals have been linked to kidney cancer via U.S. courts in one of the largest scientific studies of PFAS, in which 69,000 people in West Virginia donated blood. And so when I learned of this in 2017 and noticed that my family members who lived outside of the contamination zone didn't get kidney cancer, didn't succumb to cancer, or didn't have require kidney transplant, like one of my 14-year-old cousins did a couple of years ago, I decided to try and seek advocacy of what happened and also seek justice for my family, many of whom were, our U.S. military veterans, and some of them, while they were deployed fighting on behalf of the United States Army in Iraq, their children and their wives' drinking water were being contaminated and poisoned by the Air Force in Colorado Springs. So we've been trying to go to Congress to get an investigation and to get justice. There's never been an independent, even though the Air Force has admitted doing this, there's never been an independent investigation of their actions by either the EPA or the Colorado State Department of Health, despite the state of Colorado a couple of years ago having a budget surplus of over $1 billion. And it's still not regulated at the federal level. In the drinking water, it's not regulated at the state level in Colorado. And so we're trying to seek, answers and to seek justice. And because of Colorado's crazy 2-year statute of limitations, a lot of my family members, even though the Air Force has admitted doing this, there's no legal repercussion for this, like my grandparents, because we can't go to court and sue because, my grandmother died in 1995, or they said we should have sued within 2 years of her dying, but obviously we didn't know of the water contamination until 2016. So Congress will be our only avenue of getting justice. And so we've been going to Congress and testifying and meeting with members of Congress to try and get an independent congressional investigation with the same vigorousness that they've been investigating other things of late, with subpoenas issued, so we can try and figure out why this happened and how we can prevent it happening for the future. And, me being an ICU nurse, what I'm seeing now with COVID, getting a vaccine is a big priority, but PFAS is in 99% of Americans' blood, as Rob will tell you. But it's also been shown to decrease the effectiveness of vaccines, even in children. So I think, we really have to address this PFAS contamination, if we're going to ever be able to come up with an effective vaccine for COVID-19. So, that's one of the things that concerns me now is how will this affect a COVID-19 vaccine, when scientists have shown it's how it decreases the effectiveness of vaccinating, especially in our children.
Mark, can you maybe speak to what are some of the parallels then that you're seeing between PFAS and the crisis that we're facing with COVID-19?
I'm just seeing that, it's basically the immune, PFAS has been shown to decrease immune responses, and it's also effectiveness of vaccines. And one of the things that they say is causing a lot of the deaths with COVID-19 is what they call these cytokine storms. And PFAS has been shown to actually increase cytokine storms and increase the release of cytokines. So I'm definitely seeing that parallel. And, it's just a lot of children now, we're finding out, especially in New York, 157 are sick with inflammatory responses, which PFAS has also been shown to be tied with as well. So, those are the some of the things I've seen that's similar, along as, people not being able to really advocate on their own. It takes a very strong federal government response. And that's been unequal in different places in different states. So those are the similarities that I've seen.
So thank you for that. Drawing on your military background, and you, Liz, and I, we all live in Colorado Springs, or El Paso County, which is a military community. What are some of the additional challenges that military communities might face when confronted with PFAS contamination?
I think one, they tend to be like a lot of my cousins, they tend to be very conservative. They don't really, like to get that much involved in politics. So a lot of my cousins are veterans. They really didn't want to talk to a lot of the media, the national media. And then also, just to give an example, when you see dark waters at Parkersburg at the time, I think DuPont employed like over 3,000 people. And at the time, worldwide, they employed 98,000 people worldwide. And people were scared to take on DuPont, and they were scared to hold them accountable. Currently, right now in Colorado Springs, just in Colorado Springs, Colorado, the DOD employs close to 100,000 people. So if you're scared to challenge DuPont over 3,300 people, imagine what it's like when the person that's admitted contaminating your drinking water for a decade employs 100,000 people. And so it's just very difficult. And then, as you know, my mother worked for Space Command for years at Peterson. They're trying to get the new Space Corps be headquartered at Colorado Springs. So it's just very hard to want to hold the DOD accountable, but then also depend on them for, the economy and jobs. And so those are the biggest challenges that we're finding, just being able to hold the DOD accountable without turning it into a political gamesmanship.
Thank you, Mark, so much for sharing your story with us. Just to let our viewers know that if there are questions for Mark, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the last 30 minutes of this event. We'll move on to Rob Bilott. Rob Bilott is the attorney who successfully fought back against DuPont's reckless contamination of the drinking water in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Rob has recently published a book, Exposure, talking about his work. Rob, thank you for joining us. In the movie, we see you in a room alone with a truckload of discovery documents, boxes that have come from DuPont. And hopefully, due to your efforts in the past 20 years, you're not feeling as alone in this. I was wondering if you could speak to how have you seen awareness around PFAS change in the last 10 years or 20 years?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having this event and providing this forum for people to learn more about these chemicals. And to those of you who have seen the movie Dark Waters, you see that this took many years to get this story out to the public, so that we're all able to now talk about this. It took almost 20 years to dig out information that was within the company files and within the industry files for many years about the health effects of these chemicals. And to finally be able to have these conversations with communities now that we're finding, unfortunately, all across the country, all across the world, that are now dealing with these chemicals, and at least being able to now provide resources to folks where they can find out what we now know about these chemicals, what's already been done. Science already tells us about it, and at least be able to start moving in the right direction to actually do something about it. It's only been really within the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen anybody really even discuss this. There was an article that came out in 2016 in the New York Times Magazine that really the first articles that summarize this entire history, and really for the first time started identifying different sites across the country where not only PFOA, the chemical you see discussed in the movie that DuPont used, but several of these related chemicals, things like PFOS that was used in firefighting foams, for example, where this article was one of the first articles that really started to identify these different places across the country, including in Colorado, where these chemicals were suddenly being found in the drinking water. And that really started to spur, for the first time, people saying, what is this stuff? Hey, wait a minute. This isn't just an issue in West Virginia, in a small town. Why are these chemicals turning up in the water in Colorado, in New York State, in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in California? What's a safe level for these? And more importantly, how do we get it out of our water right now? And who's going to pay to clean all of this up? We really saw those discussions begin in 2016 after that New York Times article came out, and after the US EPA for the first time came out with its first long-term guideline for these chemicals in drinking water. And that prompted, for example, the Department of Defense as Mark explained, these chemicals have been used in military bases across the country, in firefighting foams that have been sprayed out into the environment for many, many years. Well, after the EPA came out with that guideline in 2016, we saw the Department of Defense start identifying hundreds of sites across the United States and worldwide where these chemicals likely had been used in firefighting foams. And testing finally started to look for these chemicals. These chemicals had been used for decades and decades and likely had been being emitted out into the environment and were in the water for long periods of time. But it was only around 2013 to 2016 that this testing started beginning, and people started finally learning that these chemicals were in their water and started demanding that standards be set. US EPA came out with its guideline of 70 parts per trillion. States and regulators across the country who looked at that decided that standard probably isn't as stringent as it should be, and started setting even lower numbers. States like New Jersey and New York and California and Michigan. So we've seen states set even lower and lower thresholds for these chemicals in water. And now the unfortunate problem is we've got millions of people across the United States who now realize these chemicals are in their water or have likely been there for many, many years. Almost all of us now have these chemicals in our blood. Babies are born pre-polluted with these chemicals in our blood. Everything that's been emitted over the last 50, 60 years is still out there because these chemicals don't break down under natural conditions. You hear them referred to now as forever chemicals because of that. What goes out into the environment stays there. What gets into our blood and into living things tends to stay there as well. So now you have communities all over the country that are struggling with trying to figure out how to get this stuff out of our water, how to get it cleaned up, and who pays for this. These are extremely expensive systems to put in these communities to try to filter these chemicals out of the water. And unfortunately, because these chemicals still to this day are not regulated at the federal level as hazardous substances, the Department of Defense, for example, at all of these military bases, says that because they haven't been designated hazardous, they're not allowed to go out and start cleaning them up. And that's being used as an excuse and as a shield not to go out and actually do cleanup of these chemicals. So communities are left with the costs of having to put filtration systems in, millions and millions of dollars. States are now having to struggle with the cost of going out and sampling for these chemicals. Ohio, for example, is now doing statewide sampling. Michigan has done statewide sampling. New Jersey, other states are talking about doing it as well. Incredibly expensive. And then you have the cost of what do you do when you find this in the water supplies? And the taxpayers shouldn't be the ones paying for these costs. But unfortunately, that's what's happening in most of these communities because the companies are still to this day that used, made, and released these chemicals out into our environment, knowing they would get out there, stay there forever, get in us and stay there. They're still denying responsibility for cleaning this up, and they're still fighting about it. Legislation's being proposed at the federal level, at state level, to try to get these cleanups done. But it still really isn't happening yet. So it's incredibly important that we have these discussions like we're having tonight in communities, particularly there in Colorado, that are struggling with what to do with these chemicals, who should pay for cleaning them up, to provide a forum to get this information out, and so that people understand why these chemicals are of a concern, what we do know about the severe health threat that they pose, why we should be getting them out of our water, and why we, the people who are exposed and drinking it, shouldn't be the ones paying for it. So I really have to thank the folks that participate, and Mark Ruffalo in particular for putting the movie Dark Waters together. I also did a book called Exposure to try to provide the background of how the science was developed that tells us what we know about these chemicals now. So that when these chemicals show up in these communities, people aren't left wondering, what are they? And gee, is there any science about this? that there are resources now available to people, hopefully, that give them information to understand why we need to do something about this now. And I really want to thank everybody here tonight who's participating in this discussion, particularly Mark, Fran, Liz, and also everybody that's listening and submitting questions. It's really important that we have these kinds of discussions. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. In your new book, Exposure, you go into detail about your decades-long struggle to bring DuPont chemicals to justice. And you talked a little bit about making the polluters pay, but how can we make sure that the polluters and not the public pay for the cost of PFAS cleanup?
Well, these chemicals are completely man-made chemicals. They did not exist on the planet prior to World War II, when they were invented primarily by the 3M company and other companies that then started using them and releasing them out into the environment. So everything we're finding out there in the environment is essentially a fingerprint back to these companies that put these chemicals out there knowing that they would stay in the environment, that they would eventually get into us. And really, we need to find ways to make sure that the companies that did that and profited enormously from it for decades are held responsible to pay for the costs caused by that release into the environment. There's legislation that's being proposed in various states across the country, at the federal level, in the EU, in different countries under international treaties, and there are government entities, water providers, states that are taking action, filing lawsuits, trying to hold those companies responsible for these costs, so that the individuals and those of us who are drinking this and being exposed every day aren't stuck paying the tab for this.
Thank you for that. One last question is that we hear a lot about the newer generation PFAS, the Gen X and the shorter chain PFAS, and we hear that they're safe. Is this accurate?
Well, what we know the most about the PFAS chemicals that have 8 carbons. You hear them referred to as C8s because of that, the PFOA and PFOS. PFOA is the one, for example, that's featured in dark waters. But as we finally were getting information out to the public about what those chemicals are, what they can do, why we shouldn't be using them, and they started to finally get phased out and banned in places across the world, what happened is the companies started bringing out these quote safe replacement chemicals, things with a couple fewer carbons. Instead of C8, they might have C6 or C4s. And those have been brought out onto the market over the last 10 years or so. The phase out of PFOA, for example, started around 2006. And since that time, these other chemicals have been brought out and put into these same products. And unfortunately, we're starting to find those in water and in the environment all over the place. And unfortunately, there's less known. There's less information available to the public about those chemicals. And the concern is, look how long it took us to find out what we now know about one of those, PFOA. It took 20 years to dig that information out. And what we found was there was a lot already known about those chemicals going back decades. So right now, all we know is the public doesn't have access to much information about these new chemicals. But what we are seeing is some of the toxicity studies that are starting to come out. For example, on one of them called Gen X, a replacement for PFOA, shows that particular chemical actually, there was an animal study that came out with rats that showed the same types of tumors being formed by that chemical that had been formed by PFOA. So that is raising red flags across the world among researchers and scientists saying, we need to take a comprehensive look at this entire class of chemicals. We can't be looking at just one at a time. Otherwise, it becomes this whack-a-mole game where we spend 20 years looking at one chemical. We finally get to the point where we can begin regulating that and controlling it, and then we simply tweak it a bit, call it something new, and start this entire process all over again. And in the meantime, millions of people get exposed, and we have to wait for them to develop cancer before we do something. So there's a growing movement now among regulators and scientists worldwide to address these in a much more comprehensive way. And one of the things I've actually done recently is trying to find a way to get the appropriate health studies done now to tell us exactly what all of these chemicals will do to us. We're not just exposed to necessarily just one at a time. As people, we're exposed to a lot of these, and we have a lot of these mixing in our blood at the same time. So we need to know what's the cumulative synergistic effects of having all of these in us at the same time. Nobody's really looked at that. And we shouldn't have to be the ones paying for those studies. The government shouldn't have to be the ones paying for those studies. So I have recently filed a case in Ohio where I'm seeking to bring claims on behalf of everyone in the country who has these chemicals in their blood, and asking that independent scientists be empowered to study this whole class nationwide, and be able to independently confirm what this mix of PFAS chemicals can do to us, and have the companies pay for that, not us. And that's pending right now.
Thank you so much for all of your advocacy, Rob, on behalf of those who are impacted by PFAS contamination. And it sounds like 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood. So that is quite a large number there. For our listening audience, please post questions for Rob in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can during the last portion of the panel discussion. And for those of us who are just joining us, you're watching a live panel discussion hosted by Colorado environmental organizations on PFAS pollution. We're posting a link in the chat to a petition that anyone can sign. And the petition is a letter to the Colorado Water Quality Commission asking them to adopt a narrative policy standard for PFAS water in Colorado. It will protect our drinking and our groundwater. Now we're going to hear from Liz Rosenbaum. She's a military mom, an activist, and a co-founder of the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition. Liz also drank contaminated water. She's been a strong advocate for her local community. Liz, thank you for joining us. How has the Fountain Valley community reacted to information that they drank PFAS contaminated water for decades?
Fran, that's a really great question. We've been dealing with this issue since the spring of 2016. And in the beginning, like Rob talked about, not a lot was known what had happened. Our county emergency response system was ready to bring water into our community, thinking that it was something that had just happened. Not realizing that it had happened and been occurring since the 1970s, possibly. As time went on, people felt that their voices were not being heard. They still didn't understand what had happened to them. So I started meeting with some friends in my living room, and it grew into the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, where we have once a month meetings. And we have guest speakers. And our guest speakers have included the water managers of the water districts, who are just amazing people who have gone above and beyond to make sure that our water was immediately switched off the contaminated aquifer and brought in other water sources. So what we're dealing with now is what the health effects have been for us prior to 2016.
And Liz, how do you see the state moving forward to identify and protect other communities from contamination?
Well, thanks to the Sierra Club, we wouldn't be to the point where we are with our community or even in the state. We just are always indebted and grateful for what the Sierra Club and other environmental groups have been able to assist us with. They bring in their knowledge, financial backing to help us set up legislation last year to ban toxic firefighting foam so we can also protect our firefighters. The Fountain Fire Chief is a retired Air Force firefighter and is proud that the foam they're using now in Fountain is fluorine-free. And yet we're still fighting. We have some pushback that's going on. We don't know what the storage situation of these chemicals looks like across our state. So we've had to do a survey, which only 25% of people have responded back with the data with that. We have some other issues going on this year because of the COVID financial crisis. How are we going to fund different things with our state health departments to do additional testing? Certain areas have already gotten immediate assistance. There's a giant water filtration system that's being built now. The Army Corps of Engineers is spearheading that project. So if you drive down the middle of town, you can see all kinds of giant water pipes. Everything's being redone for the future. But it's that long-term sustainability that, we're just small water districts that are having to deal with this problem. And it's good to realize, we're all downstream from someone. And the other thing that we're having to deal with is wastewater. A lot of companies are still dumping PFAS chemicals into the wastewater system, and who should pay for that? It should be the chemical manufacturers need to filter this out at their source before it affects the rest of the people downstream.
Thank you for sharing that, Liz. People feel overwhelmed when they first learn that their drinking water is contaminated. So how did you turn that feeling of fear into activism?
Right. That's something that we have always found a way to deal with. We say with our water coalition, we turned our anger into action. We're still angry about what's going on, but we're starting to see some good headway by talking to elected officials and being in touch with other coalition leaders across the United States. Last March, Fran, you and I and Rob and Mark got to go to Boston and meet other coalition leaders and scientists that are just, doing the best they can to help educate regular people of what has happened to them. And we need to keep that anger, and we need to keep driving for action, because there's always something that's going to pop up in the news or a crisis across our nation. And like Mark talked about, in our community, we're some of the most contaminated people. During COVID, we have so many autoimmune diseases, compromised health conditions, that we need to be quite a bit more aware of things that are going on to protect ourselves, wear a mask, wash our hands. And we are definitely a more vulnerable community here in the Fountain Valley.
If you're just joining us, we've heard from our three panelists, Mark Favors, Rob Bilott, and Liz Rosenbaum. I'm Fran Silva-Blayney, your moderator, and please post questions in the chat. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for sharing their stories. And before we open up the chat to questions, so that our listening and viewing audience is aware, we do have several places in Colorado that have known PFAS contamination. You heard Liz and Mark talk about Fountain Valley. PFAS contamination has also been found in the Sugarloaf Fire District in Boulder County, in Commerce City, on the U.S. Air Force Academy and the surrounding community in Colorado Springs, and at the Suncor refinery. And we still need the state to investigate other possible contamination sites. In Colorado, we need more studies to determine where PFAS contamination is and what chemicals, short chain, long chain. We need to find out what we're dealing with. We also have occupational exposures. For example, firefighters are exposed through their turnout gear. But while we need more testing, thanks to community activists like Liz and Mark, and for thanks to the work that Rob Bilott has done and environmental groups, we have seen a little progress in Colorado for addressing the PFAS issue. Just as a quick example, Colorado set site-specific groundwater standards for PFOA and PFOS in 2018. Last year, there was a ban in Colorado on PFAS in firefighting foam in training. And currently, there is a state move to test for water contamination pending action from the Water Quality Control Commission. And this is the action that we are encouraging everyone to take. We want you to ask the Water Quality Control Commission to adopt the narrative standard for PFAS in drinking water. Right now, in the chat, you'll find a link to a site that allows you to email the Water Quality Control Commission and demand strong protection for Colorado waters. So now we have time for some questions from our viewers. Again, please use the chat to submit a question, and also keep an eye out because we'll be offering some quick answers and putting up links in response to questions. So the first question is for Rob, and this is from Joanna Bates. In this present administration, how do we work to get cleanup done without us bearing the cost of cleanup and have the companies responsible for poisoning bear the costs?
Well, thanks for the question. I think the answer is probably the same now as it would have been in prior administrations. Unfortunately, we're talking about a problem here with PFAS that has gone back decades, and unfortunately, the way our regulatory system works and the way laws are set, it is an incredibly slow, painfully slow, glacially slow process. And what's happened is really the only way that folks have been able to get their water cleaned up, get medical monitoring, get damages for harm that was caused, was unfortunately in the courts. And as a lawyer, I'll be the first to tell you, I'm not here speaking on behalf of any client tonight. I'm here in my personal capacity, but I'll be the first to tell you that's not what people should have to do. But they shouldn't have to go get lawyers and go into court. But unfortunately, right now, that's really been the most effective way to get the water cleaned up, get relief. Water providers are doing that now. States are doing that. Communities are doing that. And really, that's been the avenue, unfortunately, for people to get the most effective and the most timely relief so far.
Thank you, Rob. This next question is for Liz. Liz, what is currently happening in Fountain Valley? Have there been any type of study for PFAS impacts for community residents?
Thanks, Fran. We did qualify or were selected for the ATSDR, which is part of the Center for Disease Control, to do an environmental and health study in our community. Unfortunately, with the COVID outbreak that is going on and the short staff that's happening with the CDC, our studies have been pushed off. And that's a really detrimental thing in communities that have been contaminated. We did have a 200-person blood study done, and the PFH excess, the toxic firefighting foam levels in most Americans is 1.4 nanograms. Mine is 19.9. So as time goes on, these levels go lower and lower, even though they are a forever chemical. So it's kind of like going to a crime scene 3 years later and collecting evidence. In this case, we're approaching year 5. The carpets in people's homes. I know when my kids were little in 2003, I paid that little extra bit to have the carpets sprayed with Scotchgard. I mean, we need to know what the environmental impacts are in our community in conjunction with how much of this we ingested, because ingesting it to the volume that most of us did is very detrimental to our health. And we need to understand the type of things we need to be on the lookout for with our doctors. We know that we've been exposed. Well, if you tell your doctor around here, the majority of them are like, I don't know what PFAS is. So we need more funding from the federal level and the state level. I live in a small rural community now, and the toxic firefighting foam level is 50 parts per trillion, which is less than 70. And our bigger local water districts have gotten everything to a non-detect. This is going to be a problem for a really long time. And when we all started meeting once a month over 4 years ago, if you would have told us we would still be fighting this 5 years later, you know, you need to read Rob Bilott's book, Exposure. He has been doing this for 20 years. And I hope that we get to settle this pretty soon. I don't know, just as time progresses, Fran, I don't know, I'm worried about, what the results will be. But thank you for that question.
Thank you, Liz. This next question is for Mark. You mentioned that it is extra challenging to advocate in contaminated military communities where people are basically fighting against their employer. What do you think about a new congressional mandate that the military offer PFAS blood testing to its firefighters?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a good thing. I think, they need to be able to also expand that into not just the firefighters, but to any person, civilian or military family that's in one of the over 400 military bases that the Pentagon has told Congress are contaminated, have PFAS water contamination. So I think that that's a start, but they need to go beyond that, so we can find out just how far this contamination has spread.
Thank you, Mark. Just a quick note here. Rob, you're getting a lot of kudos and thanks in the chat. And we have a question from Jessica for you. What did the Dark Waters movie miss regarding this issue?
Don't know if it missed much, frankly. I think they did a great job in taking a really complex story. It's scientifically complex, it's legally complex, and it spans 20 years. They did a good job at really hitting the essence of what happened there and showing, more importantly, what it was like to live in one of these communities and to actually deal with this on a daily basis. And I'm hoping that, when people come out of that movie, they realize this is not a movie just about Parkersburg, West Virginia. It's about all of us. This is a problem. This PFAS problem is impacting virtually the entire country and now almost the entire world. And hopefully people will be inspired after seeing that to know that every one of us can make a difference. Every one of us can speak out, as folks here on this panel have been showing tremendous leadership in doing that here in Colorado. But in all of these communities, to be able to stand up and speak out and say, what, we don't like this. we don't want this in our water. It needs to be removed. We need to have appropriate safety standards. We need to know exactly what these chemicals will do to us. And what, it can be done. If somebody like Wilbur Tennant, who you see in the movie, a farmer in rural West Virginia, is able to stand up and take on a big company like this, which leads to, frankly, the entire world beginning to regulate this PFOA chemical. I think we can take on the rest of these PFAS chemicals, and hopefully everybody will be inspired to do that.
Well, Rob, that's a great segue to a question here from Judith. She wants to know if the EU has done any limiting of PFAS.
Yes, in fact, and to some degree, they're a little further ahead than we are here in the U.S. There is more discussion in the EU about dealing with these chemicals on a class-wide basis, in trying to set standards for all of them instead of doing one at a time and 20 years between each regulation. There are international treaties as well that are being where these chemicals are being proposed to be outright banned and phased out. So in fact, in even standards set as far as how much can be in clothing or in food. So to some degree, we're seeing progress happening quicker and a little more comprehensively, frankly, overseas than we see it here at the federal level. You know, we've been trying to get federal drinking water standards set for these chemicals for almost 20 years now. And it's just remarkable to think, given everything we know about, let's just take one of them, PFOA, the most comprehensive, massive human health studies ever done on a chemical like this, with all the animal toxicology data you could ever want, human data, worker data, residential data, testing data, every kind of risk assessment you can think of, yet we still cannot get that one PFAS chemical officially regulated here in the US, which I think is why we're seeing such frustration at the state level and states having to take this on themselves. But hopefully we'll see progress soon. And I think, you know, as Mark pointed out with the current pandemic issue, I think if anything, we ought to be even talking about this a lot more. You know, here we've got a family of chemicals that have been shown to decrease our immune response and potentially decrease the effectiveness of vaccines. I mean, think about that. It's in the water of millions of people in this country right now. It's in our blood. And that's kind of the last thing you'd want in your water and blood at this point. And there needs to be more discussion happening right now about what we can do to address it now. So again, I think it's great that we're having this discussion, and thank you to everybody asking these questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rob. There's actually a question for me from Rick. He wants to know, how can we join in the efforts, and is it all under the auspices of the Sierra Club? And the answer to that is no. There are several environmental conservation community organizations in Colorado. We have Conservation Colorado, Earth Justice, Green Latinos, the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, Environment Colorado, and PEER, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. We're all working on this PFAS issue. This question is for anyone on our panel. It's from Barb, and she wants to know, do we know if PFAS chemicals accumulate in fish and other wildlife from contaminated water below dumping sites? Liz, do you want to, I see you nodding your head.
Sure, I'll take that question. These chemicals masquerade as a protein in our cells. So if you think of a cell floating around and then it needs a protein, well, the PFAS connects to that. And as it gets filtered through our kidneys and everything, it looks like a healthy cell and it gets kicked back into our body to get reused rather than, oh, that's not right, let's kick it out. So wildlife is the same as all of us. So sure, we should be able to get some feedback on the wildlife. Unfortunately, if we can't fund for human exposure, which I think should be done first, being aware of areas around places that have been contaminated, I think it's really important to put up warning signs. And Mark and I had walked along certain areas in Fountain Creek where we know it's really contaminated more than other areas, thanks to testing done by Colorado College students, but there aren't any signs put up. So like Fran just listed some amazing organizations that you can be part of to help us, you know, take on that segment, take that on. We need people to be really passionate about that area. And get involved. So thank you for that question, and I hope you can join us and get a solution for that area. Thank you, Fran.
And you know, I'll jump in real quick on that too. You know, as far as whether these chemicals can accumulate and build up in fish, yes. In fact, there has been pretty extensive sampling of fish in various places And several states have actually taken the step of issuing fish advisories. For example, in Michigan and in Minnesota, where particularly I think with PFOS being found at high concentrations in fish. And in fact, there's even been deer advisories put in place in some places. Unfortunately, these chemicals do manage to find their way into wildlife and can build up to levels of concern.
Thank you for that. Mary is asking, do all airports use this chemical? And how can she find out if this chemical has been used at an airport if she near her or others in her community?
I'll jump in on that. I think that historically, these chemicals, these PFAS chemicals, have been one of the main ingredients used in firefighting foams, and most of the airports and places that were dealing with petroleum-based potential fires likely used these or stored them, and some of these places may still store some of these older materials on site. There's been over the last several years efforts to move away from many of those materials. Some of them contain these newer replacement chemicals we talked about earlier with C4s and C6s. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of that out there. And many of these airports or even some of the fire departments may not even know or fully have been told exactly what is in those materials. So they may not even know, frankly. There's a lot of this information was treated as confidential business information by the manufacturers. So it wasn't as if it was really easy to understand exactly what was in these chemicals when they were sent out all over the country.
Thank you. Liz, I think you can also speak to this one.
Yes, thank you. So we have some current legislation that will continue to be heard. So please reach out to me after this if you want to get more involved. Denver International Airport said in one of the committee hearings in Denver that they do not want this used at their airport anymore. However, there is one airline asking for an exemption. So we have to fight against that. We have to get this to be stopped, even though they say they're going to use best practices. None of us are going to believe the best practices because we literally have not seen that happen in the past. So for us, Denver International Airport is encouraging everyone to stop using it and switch over to the different foam. So thank you, Fran.
Thank you, Liz. I think the final question that we'll have time for is, what should the state of Colorado be doing to stop PFAS contamination and to clean up impacted sites? And of course, the follow-up question for that would always be, who's going to pay for this? Mark, why don't we start with you? What should Colorado be doing right now to stop the contamination and clean up the impacted sites?
For one, I think they should be doing a serious independent investigation of all the places where there's known contamination, like in Colorado Springs. We do not know, even though the Air Force has admitted doing the contamination, we do not know how far the contamination has spread. So I think, one, they need to find out how far in places where there's known contamination, how far that it's spread. And I think they need to investigate all other suspected places, and they need to regulate it. They need to regulate it in the drinking water, the groundwater, the air. Do things to protect our firemen and women and their clothing. That's while they're risking their lives, is very toxic, and they just need to take it seriously and just do an independent investigation. I think they also need to follow like the FDA does with our pharmaceuticals, because with all this talk on the COVID vaccine, one thing is, like, they say, oh, you can't a vaccine will not be approved until it's proven safe. Yet we can dump unlimited amounts of toxic chemicals into our drinking water without having to prove any type of safety. So I think, that's one of the things that Colorado needs to do. They maybe need to find a state level of the FDA's pharmaceutical programs in which, polluters must prove that these chemicals are safe first before they're allowed to dump them into our drinking and groundwater.
Thank you, Mark. Liz?
I agree with everything that Mark just said. If we're testing for vaccines, if we're testing for food before it's put out on the market, why are we letting chemical companies dump to see if they get caught later? This whole letting them self-regulate is not working. And we have to set up laws, because when they contaminate us, they look back and they say, you didn't have a law that said we couldn't. So we have to protect ourselves, just like Rob Bilott has said. And I just appreciate everything he's done. And I've seen that movie probably a dozen times now, and I still learn something from it. This is a problem we all need to participate in finding a solution for, because it's not just PFAS. We have to prevent things from happening rather than always reacting to them.
Thank you, Liz. Rob, final thoughts. What should Colorado be doing that we're not doing?
Well, I think all states have incredible powers that most of us as individuals don't have. They can do things. They can make orders to require people to test, to take action, to clean things up that most of us can't do, even if we do go into court. So, a lot of states are looking at trying to make sure that they are doing everything they can to hold those who are truly responsible for this mess responsible, and to make sure that those that have actually caused this problem, who actually put these chemicals out there, knowing they were going to get into our environment and into our water and into our blood and put us at risk for various health problems, that those people are paying the costs associated with this, not us, not those of us who are drinking this, those of us who are paying taxes. And the states have incredible abilities to do those things. And there are a number of states that are taking action to do that right now, bringing litigation and doing statewide testing programs, trying to find out exactly the scope of the problem within the state, and then hold those responsible who have caused that problem.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. And I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our panel, to Rob, Liz, and Mark, for your time and your engagement on PFAS issues. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. We are working to develop safe ways for our communities to engage and advocate for clean air and water and healthy communities during the coronavirus crisis. So please remember to tell the Water Quality Control Commission to protect Colorado's waters from PFAS. The link is in the chat box, and stay tuned for other ways to get engaged. We are now moving to Ian Tafoya with the Colorado Latina Forum and the Green Latinos to give us some final thoughts about PFAS issues and the need for urgent action. Thank you all for joining us.
Hello and welcome. My name is Ian Thomas Tafoya, and I am the Colorado Water and Climate Organizer for Green Latinos. I want to thank you for watching this film and for taking the time to listen to these amazing people whom, as you've heard, have spent much of their lives fighting for justice and fighting for change for other people. I just want to begin by holding space and saying thank you to all of the water protectors and the people who so often put themselves on the line, or unfortunately industry puts them on the line. I'd also like to take a moment just to acknowledge all the indigenous people in the indigenous lands who have spent millennia protecting the water. Mini Wachoni, water is sacred. I myself am descended from the Hickory Apache, from the headwaters of the Rio Grande. We are so fortunate here in Colorado to be the headwater state. To share water with more than 24 states is an amazing feat, and we have a huge responsibility to be the ones to protect it. I want you to take a minute, and I want you to think about the very first memory you have of water. For some, it's puddles, maybe it's rain, maybe it's the first time you can remember jumping in a lake, but these powerful memories are what we need to go to inside. When we face these hard battles, we sometimes feel like giving up because the roadblocks seem insurmountable. I can tell you that when you are hurting, you can go to the purest waters and it will help you. Now, we are here asking and talking to you about calls for action on what effort you can take, what you can personally do to help change the course of these pollutants, to help us figure out where they are and track them down and remediate the problems. You know, for decades, these polluters have profited, and the government has had to be the detective to figure out the problems. And sometimes it's not even the government. We've seen here examples of community efforts, of people and lawyers who are willing to take on the hard fight against big industry. Now, communities are the ones that ultimately pay this price tag, whether it be through sickness and pain and loss, or through increased costs at utilities who are responsible for cleaning the water to elevated standards. But ultimately, the polluters are the ones that are responsible. You've heard tonight about stories here in Colorado, in Fountain and near the Air Force Academy. I'm here to bring awareness also that in South Adams County and near Suncor Refinery, we are finding these chemicals. This is a battle that is in everyone's backyard, and it is in everyone's interest to ask for the strongest standards. Now you're going to see here in the chat, and we're going to also email you what you can do to take action with the Water Quality Control Commission. Right now, they are looking at a narrative standard, a way to start this process of figuring out how do we unravel the complexity of all of these different chemicals, and how do we ensure they don't end up in your body or mine or your child's or your grandmother's or your TO's. We need you to participate July 13th, to go on there and to talk to these commissioners, to send letters, to take the action that we send to you, to say that we deserve the strongest standards and we are responsible for the strongest standards because we are the headwater state. We can join our peers who are pushing these limits to be the most aggressive for protecting human health and public health. We have to get caught up. For the last 20 years, the industry has put us behind the ball. I know that we have to fight together, and I know that it's not easy. I know that it seems like if you're an environmentalist, we're fighting on many fronts, and we are, but you're not fighting alone. Thank you for taking this time to realize that water is sacred. And I will say one last time that if you need healing, go to the purest waters, to the hot springs, to the national parks, and know why we protect these things. If you'd like to know more, follow those links. If you'd like to know more about the Green Latinos, check us out, greenlatinos.org. Thank you so much.